There are questions that should never be spoken aloud, questions whose answers lie buried beneath decades of silence, hidden behind locked doors and burned letters. Questions that, once voiced, unravel entire lives like thread pulled from decaying fabric. In the spring of 1847, a young enslaved woman named Denina asked such a question. She spoke it only once, in a voice barely above a whisper, standing in the doorway of the plantation house kitchen. The man she asked, the overseer, a brutal figure named Horace Vance, was found 3 days later hanging from the oak tree behind the stables, his own belt around his neck, his face frozen in an expression witnesses would later describe as knowing. But Denina's question didn't die with Vance. It spread through the quarters like wildfire, whispered in the tobacco fields, murmured over cooking fires. And as it spread, other secrets began surfacing, secrets that had been carefully hidden for nearly 20 years, secrets tied to the master's family, the bloodlines of the plantation, and a truth so harrowing that it would eventually consume everyone who touched it. This is the story of Thornhill Plantation in Lunenburg County, Virginia, where a simple question about resemblance became a death sentence, and where the answer revealed a horror far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Before continuing with the story of Thornhill Plantation and the question that shattered it, I need you to do something. If this introduction has already given you chills, hit the subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because stories like this, buried deep in America's darkest past, are what we explore here every week. And I want to know, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Now, let's discover what Denina saw that spring morning and why her question could never be safely asked. Thornhill Plantation sprawled across nearly 800 acres of Virginia's rolling Piedmont. Its main house, a 3-story Georgian structure with white columns that gleamed in the afternoon sun, dominated the estate. The land had once been hunting grounds for the Saponi people before they were displaced westward by colonial expansion. By 1798, when Colonel James Fairchild purchased the property with profits from the tobacco trade, no trace of the original inhabitants remained, save the occasional arrowhead unearthed by a plow. The plantation had remained in the Fairchild family for nearly 50 years by the time our story begins. Colonel James had built the main house in 1802, bringing craftsmen from Richmond to construct a home that announced the family's status to anyone who passed. The house featured a grand entrance hall with a curving staircase, parlors on either side with marble fireplaces, a formal dining room that could seat 20, and upstairs 6 bedrooms with tall windows overlooking the tobacco fields stretching to the river. Behind the main house were the dependencies: the kitchen house, built separately to reduce fire risk, the smokehouse where meat was cured, the dairy with its cool stone floor, the laundry where enslaved women spent their days over steaming tubs, the carriage house and stables, the overseer's cottage, and beyond all of these, arranged in 2 rows, the slave quarters, rough wooden cabins with dirt floors and stone chimneys, each housing anywhere from 4 to 8 people. Colonel James Fairchild died in 1825, leaving the plantation to his son, also named James. This second James Fairchild ran Thornhill for 7 years before dying suddenly in 1832 of what the doctor called apoplexy, a stroke that took him in the middle of the night, leaving him cold in his bed by morning at 41. Edward Fairchild, then 28, inherited everything: the land, the house, the debts, and the 47 human beings listed in the estate inventory, alongside livestock and furniture. He'd been married for 3 years to Catherine Whitfield, daughter of a Richmond merchant, and they had 1 infant daughter who would die of scarlet fever before her 2nd birthday. By 1847, Edward was 43 and looked older. His once dark brown hair had gone mostly gray. His face carried the weathered quality of a man who spent his days outdoors inspecting fields and checking accounts. He was not tall, perhaps 5'9", but he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone conscious of authority. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless in certain light, and they rarely revealed emotion. Catherine had died in 1838, giving birth to their only surviving child, a boy named Thomas. The birth had been long and difficult, lasting nearly 2 days, and Catherine had lost too much blood afterward. The town doctor had done what he could, but infection set in. She survived only a week, feverish and delirious, calling for her mother and crying about things that made no sense. Edward had sat with her every night, holding her hand silently. When she finally died, she was buried in the family cemetery on the hill behind the house beneath a marble stone carved with angels. Thomas was now 9, a thin boy with his father's pale eyes and his mother's delicate features. He was being educated by a tutor from Richmond, a stern Presbyterian named Mr. Gaines, who believed in Latin, mathematics, and the rod. The boy showed aptitude but little enthusiasm, spending his free hours reading in the library or wandering the grounds, always alone, always quiet. The plantation's enslaved population numbered 47 souls. That spring of 1847, the number fluctuated with births, deaths, and occasional sales, but it had remained near 50 for 15 years. Most labored in the tobacco fields stretching from the main house to the river, their days measured by the sun's arc and the overseer's watch. Tobacco demanded constant attention, from planting in April through harvest in September, and even in winter, work continued. Stripping leaves, preparing beds for the next year, repairing equipment. Others worked in the house, stables, smithy, or kitchen. There was a hierarchy among the enslaved, as always. House servants looked down on field workers. Skilled craftsmen held higher status than common laborers. Those born on the plantation felt superior to those purchased from elsewhere. But these distinctions ultimately meant little. They were all property, all subject to absolute power, all vulnerable to the same casual cruelties. Denina was 19 that April, born on the plantation to a woman named Ruth, who had died of fever when Denina was 12. Ruth had worked in the main house as a chambermaid, cleaning bedrooms, changing linens, emptying chamber pots, and attending to the family's personal needs. She had been quiet, with sad eyes and gentle hands. She had secretly taught Denina to read using a Bible she'd somehow acquired, and had shared stories of her own mother, brought from Africa as a child, who relived the ocean crossing in lifelong nightmares. Ruth died in the summer of 1840 during a fever outbreak that claimed 6 lives on the plantation. Denina, then 12, had nursed her mother through her final days, wiping her burning forehead, offering sips of water, and listening to delirious ramblings. Ruth spoke things that made no sense to the child, apologies, warnings, meaningless names, but gripped Denina's hand with surprising strength, whispering, "Don't let them make you like me. Don't let them take what they took from me." Denina hadn't understood then. She understood now. After Ruth's death, Denina moved to the kitchen to work under Bess, an older woman who had cooked for the Fairchilds for 30 years. Bess was perhaps 60, her gray hair wrapped in a cloth, her hands scarred from decades of burns and cuts. She became the closest thing to a mother for Denina, teaching her to cook, manage the kitchen's routines, and navigate the dangerous waters of serving white people who could punish you for any perceived slight. Denina was quick with her hands, quiet and observant, a trait both gift and curse. She noticed everything: Edward Fairchild's jaw tightening in anger, Mr. Gaines's lingering gaze on young enslaved women, Horace Vance taking pleasure in others' fear. She noticed patterns, connections, resemblances. Her brother Samuel, 2 years younger, worked in the stables. Born in 1830, his complexion was lighter than most at Thornhill, sometimes described as bright or yellow, with a narrow nose, thin lips, and the same pale gray eyes marking the Fairchild bloodline. Mixed-race children were an unspoken reminder of the plantation's exploitation, and their existence was managed with silence. Samuel's resemblance to the Fairchilds was undeniable. Tall, lean, broad-shouldered, long-limbed, tilting his head like Edward, long fingers, straight posture, the habit of rubbing his jaw when thinking. By 1847, at 17, Samuel looked like Edward's son, which, of course, he was. Everyone at Thornhill knew it. The enslaved had known since Samuel's childhood, understanding Ruth's shame and the implications. They knew Ruth had no choice. No was not a word enslaved women could speak to white men. Even white visitors likely noticed Samuel's likeness, but knowing and speaking were different. The system depended on silence. As long as no one spoke, Edward remained master, Samuel remained property, and the plantation's fundamental lie persisted. Blood didn't matter, family didn't matter. A man could own his brother, and it was deemed normal, until Denina asked her question. April 23rd, 1847, began like any other. Denina rose before dawn in the cabin she shared with 3 other women. Mary from the laundry, Patience from the fields, and old Aunt Sarah, too old for heavy labor. The cabin was about 12 feet square, with a dirt floor, 2 narrow beds, and a single window covered in oiled paper. Denina, dressed in homespun cotton, brown and patched, wrapped her hair, slipped on worn shoes, and walked the path to the kitchen house. The air was cool, damp, filled with the scent of earth and growing things. Spring had arrived early, trees fully leafed against the gray sky. Birds sang, mockingbirds, cardinals, and the harsh calls of crows. Bess was already kneading dough when Denina arrived. They worked in quiet, as always, preparing breakfast: biscuits, eggs, ham, coffee, preserves from last summer's peaches. Denina's mind lingered on Samuel, who 2 days prior had been caught near the main house after dark. Vance had ordered 10 lashes, to be administered at 3 that afternoon by the tobacco sheds. Denina had seen whipping before: the crack of the whip, cries of pain, bloody stripes. 10 lashes weren't the worst, but enough to humiliate and hurt. And for what? For walking near the house his father owned, for existing in a space that reminded everyone of the truth they pretended not to know. Around 8, Denina carried a tray of biscuits toward the main house and encountered Horace Vance, a stout man of 50, his face flushed, eyes calculating. He reached out, took a biscuit, chewed slowly. "Your brother's getting his lashes this afternoon," he said casually. 3 o'clock by the tobacco sheds. "You'll watch, I expect." Denina replied quietly, "Yes, sir." Vance continued, praising Ruth's obedience, hinting at Denina's place, and then moved aside. Inside, Denina passed the warming kitchen and entered the hallway leading to the dining room, where Thomas and Mr. Gaines were at work. Through the slightly ajar door, she saw Thomas at the mahogany table, Latin primer open, tutor instructing sternly. Denina thought of Samuel in the stables, rough hands and calloused, about to receive lashes for being in the wrong place. The resemblance between the boys was undeniable: pale gray eyes, sharp nose, tilted head. They were brothers, half-brothers, sharing Fairchild blood, yet destined for utterly different lives. Anger surged in Denina, years of silence, watching Samuel's suffering, observing injustices, all boiled into one moment. She pushed open the door and entered with the tray. Gaines glanced at her, blankly acknowledging her as if she were furniture. Thomas didn't look up. Denina set the tray down, hands trembling. Then, quietly but clearly, she asked, "Why does young master look exactly like my brother?" The room froze. Words hung like smoke, impossible to ignore. Gaines turned, pale, eyes wide, fear creeping in. "What did you say?" he asked, low and dangerous. Denina did not repeat it. The question existed now. Thomas looked up, confused. "Which brother?" he asked innocently. Gaines, red-faced, stepped forward, then reconsidered. "Get out," Now. Denina left the tray, left the biscuits, walked through the hallway, out the back door to the kitchen house. Bess saw her and sat beside her silently. Moments later, heavy footsteps approached. Vance appeared at the kitchen door, red-faced, breathing hard. "You," he said, pointing at Denina, "come with me." Bess protested, but Denina followed, legs steadier, mind clearer, knowing there was nowhere to run. They walked to the main house, through the front entrance, up the wide porch, into the grand entrance hall, with its black and white checkered marble floor, curving staircase, crystal chandelier, and portraits of Fairchild ancestors. Denina had never entered here except as an invisible servant. Now she felt exposed, out of place, yet resolute, bracing for what was to come. This part of the story is the point where the tension reaches an almost unbearable peak. The narrative has built a world of fear, secrecy, and unspoken truths, and now Denina's courage in speaking what was forbidden has triggered a cascade of events that the plantation and its people cannot contain. The writing emphasizes both the physical and psychological weight of the situation. Edward Fairchild's controlled authority has been broken. He is no longer the untouchable master. He is human, vulnerable, and confronted by the consequences of the secrets that were carefully buried for decades. Denina, on the other hand, embodies the moral courage and defiance that decades of oppression could not fully suppress. Her actions, speaking the truth, show both her recklessness and her bravery, and they illuminate the brutal contradictions of slavery, the natural human bond of family violently denied by law and custom. Thomas Fairchild's disappearance is symbolic and devastating. The boy has inherited the family's legacy, but Denina has planted a seed of awareness that disrupts his innocence. His flight to the old slave cemetery is deeply poetic. He seeks connection to truth, to real family history, to humanity that has been hidden from him. The cemetery itself represents both memory and resistance, a space outside the formal structures of power where the enslaved left traces of their lives and deaths. Thomas, sitting there, emaciated and tear-streaked, is a visual representation of knowledge gained too early, the cost of learning the truth of systemic cruelty. The scene also captures the psychological collapse of Thornhill Plantation. Horace Vance's death, the fleeing overseers, and the disruption caused by Denina's question reveal the fragility of the entire system. Power in Thornhill depended on silence and unquestioned authority. Once those foundations are shaken, the entire hierarchy begins to crumble. You can see that Denina is no longer just a character. She is the moral and narrative fulcrum of the story. Through her, the themes of truth, family, injustice, and the human cost of slavery are brought into sharp focus. The story is not only a historical account, but also a meditation on courage, moral reckoning, and the terrible consequences of living a lie. If you want, I can continue and craft the next scene where Edward confronts the reality of Thomas's discovery in the cemetery, including the moral and emotional reckoning that follows. It's the part where the story really begins to turn toward resolution while keeping the tension at its highest. Do you want me to do that? Had deliberately started it. Thomas said nothing, gave nothing away, and Edward didn't intervene. The sheriff, satisfied with the accident explanation, left, leaving the Fairchilds to the ruin of their legacy. In the aftermath, Thornhill Plantation felt hollow. The physical structure was gone, but the psychological weight of its history remained. The enslaved people, freed from the oppressive eye of overseers and the crushing surveillance of the Fairchild family, moved cautiously. Some whispered about the fire as divine retribution, others as a necessary cleansing. Life continued in the fields, in the quarters, in the woods, but the air was heavier, charged with an unspoken understanding that history could not be buried with ash. Edward sat on the scorched lawn for hours, his son beside him. Thomas didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't even look at his father. He simply existed as a living reminder of the truth Edward could no longer ignore. The weight of inheritance, of blood, of sin, rested on his small shoulders. And yet there was a glimmer of defiance in those pale gray eyes. He had destroyed the evidence, refused to carry the legacy blindly, and in that act of destruction had claimed a fragment of autonomy. Denina remained nearby, quiet but vigilant. She understood the power of knowledge, the danger of unspoken truths, and the importance of survival. Thomas had acted, and she had acted alongside him, a witness and protector. But she knew this was only the beginning. The plantation's skeleton remained, the fields, the enslaved population, the memories of cruelty, and someone would have to navigate it. Someone would have to reckon with the moral void left in the wake of the fire. Edward, broken, realized he could no longer command the plantation as he once had. The world he had inherited, the one built on lies, abuse, and blood, had collapsed around him. He had no solutions, no justifications, no authority left. The fire had taken the past. Now he had to confront the future, and for the first time he was terrified of what that meant. And in the shadows of the ruined house, Thomas Fairchild sat silently. The boy who had seen too much, known too much, and refused to participate in the horrors of his inheritance. The Fairchild legacy, tainted and tangled, had been burned, but the story of Thornhill and the lives it had shaped would continue, and now a new chapter began, written not by the oppressors, but by those who had survived, witnessed, and remembered. If you want, I can continue this next phase, exploring how Thomas, Denina, and the enslaved people begin to reshape their lives after the fire, and the consequences for Edward. Do you want me to continue? This is an incredibly powerful and harrowing story, one that captures the moral and psychological complexity of slavery in a way that's both intimate and devastating. Dina's simple question, "Why does young master look exactly like my brother?" acts as a lens, exposing the systemic horrors, the tangled bloodlines, and the human cost of living in a world built on lies and ownership. The story does an exceptional job of showing how truth can be both destructive and necessary. Thomas, Edward, and even Denina herself are all shaped and scarred by the revelation. But it's also the truth that allows Thomas to break free, make his own choices, and dedicate his life to justice. The fire, the ruin, the hollowing of the family, these are all symbolic manifestations of the consequences of confronting long-buried horrors. Meanwhile, the enslaved people, though still trapped, experience a brief taste of autonomy, demonstrating that even small cracks in a brutal system can create space for agency and resistance. Dina's courage stands out profoundly. She chooses truth over safety, even when the cost is enormous. She doesn't pretend or hide. She acknowledges the humanity of those enslaved and challenges the moral corruption of the Fairchilds. Her actions underscore a timeless lesson. The act of questioning and speaking truth can destabilize entrenched systems, even at great personal risk. The story also paints the long shadow of slavery vividly, how trauma, corruption, and moral compromise ripple across generations, affecting everyone connected to the system. The destruction of Thornhill Plantation is a metaphorical cleansing, but the narrative makes it clear that no single act can undo the damage entirely. Redemption, like freedom, is a long, painstaking process. Ultimately, it's a story about the power of knowledge, the courage to confront the past, and the heavy responsibility that comes with awareness. It leaves the reader with a profound moral question. When faced with uncomfortable truths, do we stay silent to preserve ourselves, or do we speak, knowing the cost, but honoring justice and humanity? If you want, I can help condense this sprawling narrative into a gripping summary or script suitable for a YouTube video while preserving all the tension and moral weight, making it even more impactful for an audience. Do you want me to do that? After the fire, Thornhill Plantation was a hollow shadow of its former self. The main house was gone, reduced to blackened ruins, the journal and family records consumed by flames. Edward Fairchild wandered the plantation like a ghost, his health and spirit broken. He continued to run the estate in name only, but the life of cruelty and control he had inherited no longer held meaning. He drank heavily, slept poorly, and existed only in the memory of what had been. In 1852, Edward died of a fever at the age of 48, leaving Thomas, just 14, as the inheritor of Thornhill. But Thomas would never live there again. Thomas went to Richmond, attended boarding school, studied law, and dedicated his life to fighting the very system his family had perpetuated. He refused to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War, worked with the Freedmen's Bureau afterward, and spent his days advocating for formerly enslaved people. He never married, never had children, and intentionally allowed the Fairchild line to end with him. When he died in 1891 at 53, his modest estate was left to organizations promoting racial justice and education, and he was buried in a public cemetery far from Thornhill. His tombstone simply marked, "He tried to do better." Denina lived to see freedom come to the enslaved people of Thornhill. She married a former slave named Joseph, had children, and built a life that honored their humanity and hard-won independence. She carried the memory of Thornhill, the lives destroyed, and the courage it took to speak the truth. She would tell her grandchildren the story, emphasizing one lesson above all. Don't ever be afraid to ask questions. The truth might hurt, but it is the only thing that can heal. The plantation itself decayed. The ruins of the house stood for decades, then eventually collapsed. New owners built a modern home on the land, unaware of the shadows that lingered. But the slave cemetery remained, hidden in the woods, a silent reminder of the people whose lives were stolen, whose names were forgotten, and whose truths were nearly buried forever. Thornhill Plantation's horror lay not in ghosts or curses, but in the lies that had sustained it. Masters had claimed ownership over human lives, twisted bloodlines, and silenced the truth. And yet, through the courage of one enslaved woman's question and one boy's resolve to confront the past, the lie was exposed, and the system, ultimately, was challenged. The legacy of Thornhill is a story of courage, destruction, and moral reckoning. The fire destroyed buildings, journals, and records, but it could not destroy the truth itself, and the truth once spoken endures, echoing through generations as a warning, a lesson, and a call to justice. Because some truths, no matter how dangerous, must be asked, and some lies, no matter how carefully maintained, must be burned away. The story of Thornhill Plantation teaches that silence and lies are the foundation of injustice. Those who fear the truth allow corruption, cruelty, and oppression to thrive. Courage comes in asking questions, speaking uncomfortable truths, and confronting the horrors others try to hide. Even when the truth brings destruction, it also brings awareness, change, and the possibility of justice. The real horror was never the ghosts or the fire. It was the system built on human suffering, secrecy, and denial. But one brave question, one choice to see clearly, can challenge generations of wrongdoing. Truth is painful, but it is the only path to healing and moral responsibility. The moral is simple. Never let fear silence the truth, because lies destroy. But truth, even when dangerous, can set the foundation for justice, freedom, and humanity.